The following is a presentation of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. All content presented is the exclusive intellectual property of CCDI. Any sharing, reproduction, or use of this material or content requires the express written permission of CCDI. Should you wish to use this content in any way, please contact Michael Bach, founder and CEO, via email at michael.bach@ccdi.ca. Thank you.
Diversity and Inclusion, the Virtual UnConference on Cultural Competence. Before we begin, please note that the information contained in this presentation reflects CCDI's knowledge and experience, but does not constitute a recipe that can be applied equally to all organizations. The presentation and related materials do not constitute rendering of legal, consulting, or any other professional services or advice of any kind. CCDI is not liable for any claims, losses, or damages of any kind arising out of or in any way related to the information provided in these webinars. Opinions expressed by participants, including panelists, are their own and not representative of CCDI. Welcome to CCDI's first Virtual UnConference for 2020. In this introductory video, we are going to cover an overview of the format for the Virtual UnConference, including a brief overview of the 3 modules, a little bit about CCDI, some key stats covering the imperative for developing cultural competence, and key concepts about diversity and inclusion and cultural competence. Part 1, more key concepts on cultural competence will be shared in Module 2 as well. And finally, we'll do a wrap-up and instructions for the Module 1 live meeting. To adjust for virtual delivery, we've divided the one-day UnConference content and discussions into 3 modules. Each module will have both a pre-work element and a live meeting. We're making every effort to ensure that the majority of content delivery occurs in the pre-work, and the live meetings will be highly interactive, involving discussions with other participants and activities in the online WebEx platform. It is strongly recommended that you complete all of the pre-work prior to that module's live meeting, as the pre-work will inform discussions and activities during the live meeting. You will have received an UnConference pre-work document from CCDI's events team, which outlines all of the pre-work for all 3 modules. Use this as your guide to prepare for each of the modules. More specifically, we're going to provide a little detail about what to expect in each module. The topic for Module 1 is an introduction to the UnConference and the imperative for cultural competence. The pre-work includes a number of things and will take about 30 minutes to complete. First of all, you'll watch this pre-recorded module. Secondly, you'll be invited to watch a video online, and as well 2 activities that relate to the dimensions of diversity. The live meeting will be 90 minutes in length, and we will build on the pre-work, focusing on key topics such as what is culture, how do people demonstrate cultural competence, and what happens when cultural differences are not managed well. For Module 2, the pre-work again will be about 30 minutes. You'll watch another pre-recorded module, and you'll be asked to complete 2 activities, one on the cultural iceberg and one on cultural asset mapping. The live meeting for Module 2 will then focus on a discussion about the cultural iceberg. We'll do a role-play activity online, and we'll talk about cultural asset mapping. Finally, Module 3, again, a pre-recorded module. You'll be asked to watch another video, and there'll be another activity to complete, as well as some information on case studies to review before we move to the last live meeting, which will be a little bit longer, and we'll focus on, again, building on the pre-work for dimensions of culture, look at cultural competence measurement tools, and discuss the case study before we talk about key goals and practices for developing cultural competence that you can take away with you. Over the course of the 3 online modules, our learning objectives are to recognize through self-awareness the depth of our diversity, to understand key concepts of cultural competence, as well as the importance of cultural competence, to learn through understanding others how individuals may differ in their cultural orientation, to learn how cultural competence can be assessed, and fundamentally to learn strategies and tips on how to build cultural competence in order to adapt more effectively in the workplace. Very briefly, CCDI is a Made in Canada solution, and this is the entity that's bringing you the Virtual UnConference this year. The Virtual UnConference is meant to build on our mission in terms of addressing the full picture of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace. And we do that by providing network and learning events in cities across Canada, like the UnConference, although it's virtual this year. We also have live and interactive webinars, Canada's largest e-library on diversity and equity issues, and free on our website access to cutting-edge reports and toolkits. Of course, we wouldn't be CCDI without the support of our founding partners who stepped up to help us get started in the first place, and whose continued support is very important. We are currently a little over 260 employer partners, and that continues to grow every year. The first part of this module focuses on the importance of developing cultural competence, and specifically, why is it imperative for Canada? We'd like to look at some of the demographic projections in Canada that look at where we are likely to be in 2031. So currently in 2020, this is 11 years down the road, and it's based on some research by Deloitte called Outcomes Over Optics, Building Inclusive Organizations. And what they wanted to do is to study the issues at the heart of Canada's future success and provide a perspective on our path to more economically inclusive and prosperous society. So what they found is that the projections look to create this kind of demographic mix, where 3 in 10 Canadians could have neither English nor French as their mother tongue. More than 1 in 4 will be foreign-born. 1 in 3 will belong to a visible minority group. Almost 1 in 4 will be over the age of 55. And the working age population will be about 61%, which will be a decrease from 68% in 2011. And lastly, by 2025, so in the next 5 years, 3 in 4 of the Canadian workforce will consist of millennials. Those are some significant demographic diversity dimensions that we really need to pay attention to as we move forward in our diversity and inclusion journey. And here's another perspective on the imperative for Canada specifically. The Environics Institute, in partnership with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, conducted an online survey between April 17th and May 6th of last year. And they sampled over 3,000 Canadians who are 18 and over. And these results were provided by the 20% of respondents who said they experienced some form of racial discrimination. And when you break it down by the settings where they were experiencing the racial discrimination, you can see that 38% were experiencing it either on the street or in the workplace, or perhaps both. What this shows is that racism is alive and well in Canada, and specifically in our workplaces. We also know that there's an imperative in terms of income equality, and I think the current circumstances are demonstrating quite strongly that we have some significant income inequalities. But here's some more specifics on that. You are almost 5 times as likely to be out of work if you're a recent immigrant with a university degree. And the unemployment rate is a difference of 11.9 versus the average 7.1 for Canadian-born high school grads. We know from the Indigenous Economic Progress Report that the income gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous groups is about 26.2 percentage points. We know that Canadians with disabilities have a higher unemployment rate compared to Canadians without disabilities. We also know that a Canadian woman still makes less for every dollar a man makes, specifically 87 cents for every dollar. And Stats Canada has put forward the perspective that about 2/3 of that wage gap are not explainable from the stats. And what they've said is it is most likely as a result of gender-based discrimination in the workforce. And lastly, a racialized person also makes less for every dollar than a white person, specifically 81 cents per dollar. So these inequities are still very much in place. Another perspective to look at why this is important for Canada is some research conducted by Rick Miner in 2014. And what he was focusing on is broadening the talent pool because we have a skilled labor shortage. His projections to 2036 indicate that the skilled labor shortage is going to be more and more urgent. And we have mismatches between geographical need, supply and demand, underemployment, overskilled employment, or overemployment. And his research suggests that the way to address this is to better engage the vast underutilized talent pools we have in Canada, which include the youth, women, immigrants, visible minorities, Indigenous people, and people with disabilities, as you saw from the previous statistics. A further imperative for Canada is a look at our dependency ratio. Dependency ratio refers to the working age population that is defined as those aged between 15 and 64. The basic indicator for employment is the proportion of the working age population who are employed and are supporting the ratio of dependents, who are people younger than 15 or older than 65. This indicator is measured as a percentage of the population, and it's simply a measure of age. So, there are some people between 15 and 64 who might not be working. But what it does indicate for Canada is that our dependency ratio was at 44% in 2012 when Rick Miner was conducting this research, and was predicted that by 2036 it would rise to 65%. So this is the period of time between 2010 and 2036. Unfortunately, what's more concerning is that the 2036 prediction for the dependency ratio was already reached in 2018. The higher the dependency ratio, the longer that people will need to either stay in the workforce or work longer in order to support those people who are dependent on them. So Rick Miner's conclusions to our impending talent shortage and the impending dependency ratio crisis is to ensure that there's greater workforce participation from currently underrepresented groups, as we've seen already. Another imperative for Canada in particular is the need to develop inclusive leadership to manage the kind of demographic diversity that we're seeing and that we're expecting over the next period of time. And Deloitte did some great research on the signature traits of inclusive leadership. This particular study mined the experiences of more than 1,000 global leaders and did interviews with 15 of those leaders as well as subject matter experts, and surveyed over 1,500 employees on their perceptions of inclusion and the role of leadership. And what they found are these 6 traits. And the one that we're interested in is cultural intelligence, which is basically another way of talking about cultural competence. And what it does is it recognizes that not everyone sees the world through the same cultural frame, which is exactly what this entire unconference is about. Cultural competence is also an imperative when you look at the kind of impact that leaders have on multicultural teams. And the lesson here is that it's all about how we manage diversity and cultural difference. Diversity yields results only when it's managed effectively, and in order to do this, we need to develop cross-culturally competent leaders. What we know from the research on the performance of teams in particular is that monocultural teams where there are shared values and perspective or cultural background, they tend to perform on average. And what we know about multicultural teams is that where a leader ignores or suppresses cultural differences, cultural difference becomes more of an obstacle to performance. It's seen as someone doesn't fit, or the individual is not seen as a team player. However, in multicultural teams where a leader acknowledges and supports cultural difference is seen as an asset. And in that respect, differences are sought, they're valued, they're promoted in a way that helps employees feel valued and that they belong. And this relates back to the maturity model for value and belonging. The impact of cultural competence has a number of different impacts that the research is quantifying. It leads to improved recruitment of diverse employees, improved team functionality, as you just saw with the impact of leaders on the performance of teams, and also on employee retention. Now that we've talked about the imperative for cultural competence, we want to make sure that we're all talking about the same concepts. So we're going to start with the 2 most important, diversity and inclusion. Diversity is simply the mix. This is a definition that was coined originally by Andres Tapia, who is now with Korn Ferry, and we use it because it's simple. The mix is about the facts. It's about what makes you unique. In fact, a colleague of mine often says that once you have 2 human beings in the same room, you have human diversity. And that's because each of us has a completely unique mix of diversity. Even if 2 people look, talk, and act similarly with similar upbringing and education, even if they're identical twins, they have a unique view on the world through their unique lens. Essentially, diversity is therefore infinite because the number of permutations of diversity is infinite. And there are different mixes. You have your own mix as an individual. Your team has a mix, your department, your organization, your location maybe, your city, town, or province. All of these mixes are what makes up the diversity around you and creates the myriad of lenses through which individuals view the world. And of course, we get our lenses from many different sources and combinations of sources. Truthfully, in the end, you're all experts in your own diversity. But you are not experts in others' diversity because you don't know what you don't know. And this is where inclusion comes in. Inclusion doesn't just happen. Where diversity is the mix, inclusion is about getting that mix to work well together. Differences or diversity can cause conflict or uncomfortableness, like drawing someone's portrait if you weren't an artist. Therefore, inclusion must be a mindful effort to ensure that everyone feels valued, respected, and able to contribute to their fullest potential. It also means it has to be an equitable effort because different people need different things. Think of it this way. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice. This is because you're an expert in your own diversity, but you aren't experts in other people's diversity, which means you don't know what you don't know. You have to make a choice to be conscious of that, to manage it well, and to move forward in creating a diverse and inclusive workplace. To provide you with a slightly different perspective, Deloitte completed a piece of research in 2012 entitled, "Waiter, Is That Inclusion in My Soup?" The findings validate what many D&I practitioners knew, which is that diversity and inclusion must be leveraged together. And this is because it has an impact on employee engagement. They found that where an organization is perceived to have a high focus on diversity and high sentiments of inclusion from its employees, this increases engagement. And engagement has a maturity element to it. We've placed this in a pyramid to show the relationship. First, employees need to feel that they're being treated fairly and with respect. This is about equity and non-discrimination. Essentially, these are table stakes for organizations. If employees feel that they're being treated fairly and with respect, then they start to feel that their unique perspective is valued in decision-making, and they begin to feel more connectedness and belonging. When you have strong feelings of value and belonging, this creates a sense of confidence and inspiration for employees. These are the kind of employees who will tell you, "I love my job," and they become some of your best ambassadors for new talent. This research supports the need for both a recognition of the depth and complexity of diversity and the need for inclusion to effectively manage diversity and create an inclusive workplace. Now that we're clear on the definitions of diversity and inclusion, let's dig a little deeper into the various aspects of diversity dimensions. So we're going to talk about what are dimensions of diversity, and this is part of one of the key aspects of cultural competence is building your own self-awareness about your own diversity. So we're going to walk through a model adapted from Loden and Rosnar to give some structure to the dimensions of diversity. Personality is at the core of who we are. Personality is something we're born with and that we refine over time. It can be defined as a combination of characteristics or qualities that form your distinctive character. For example, are you gregarious or are you shy? Are you direct or do you tell long stories about what you're talking about? This is an important component of all of us because for those of you who have been in a long-term relationship for any length of time, you know that it's the aspects of personality that never change. These are the components of who we are, at the core of who we are, that really make us the completely unique person we are amidst all of the other dimensions of diversity. Aside from your personality, we also have what we call internal dimensions. And internal dimensions are they mean internal, or they're talked about as internal because they tend to be those aspects of our character that we hold most dear, and that people will not know what they are, assuming you can't see them, unless we trust them. And that's because generally your internal dimensions are those aspects of yourself that are either you have no control or very little control over. And we hold them close because if someone uses them in a way that negatively impacts us, we can't change it. So you'll see that a number of these are the usual suspects you find in human rights legislation. because it's important to protect people from negative impact for aspects that they are unable to change. Aside from internal dimensions, we can also think about external dimensions. And external dimensions tend to be those aspects of our character that we have a little more control or choice over, some more so than others. And I should be clear that for different people, some of the aspects of internal dimensions might be external, and vice versa, external dimensions that might fit in their internal dimensions. So these are guidelines or structure to help in comprehension. It's not set in stone, and certainly it's not representative of all the different dimensions of diversity. These are just representative of the kinds of things we might think of in these different dimensions. Within external, you have lots of things that we tend to know about our colleagues because we have conversations about them, maybe at lunch, about caregiver responsibilities, or what kinds of recreational habits you might be taking on the weekend, maybe what your educational background is. Maybe we ask about different languages. Those are things that we think we know people when we know those. And when perhaps they tell you something in their internal dimensions that you didn't know before, we often have a reaction of, why didn't you tell me? Well, usually it's because it's not that they don't trust you. It's that they may not trust the organization with that information. And speaking of organization, we categorize and label employees, the workforce, in many, many different ways through human resources. And all of these aspects make up parts of your diversity as well. And it's not just who you are right now in an organization, but it's also who you've been if you've moved through different positions in that organization. And it's also the diversity that you bring with you from your experiences in other organizations where you may have had different roles. It could also be diversity from volunteering, because if you're like me, my volunteer job is like a full-time job, and I keep getting given more responsibility. So it feels like part of my organizational or my professional identity. And lastly, we can't not be impacted by what's going on around us, and certainly the current situation is a very large example of that, or a very cogent example. Cultural events, economic system changes, world events are all aspects that impact us and create different lenses on how to see the world. One more concept that is really important to keep in mind is, as you saw, there are many different ways that people's diversity comes together. And a term that is really helpful to think about is intersectionality. It was a term that was coined first by Kimberly Crenshaw of the African American Policy Forum to describe the intersection of different oppressions that may affect people. And specifically here, the term was going to acknowledge and make visible the different experiences of Black women in particular due to the intersection of race and gender. The term has now become more generalized and tends to describe how different types of discrimination interact when someone has different dimensions all in the same person. So a number of those dimensions are depicted here: disability, nationality, race. Enough to say that each one of those has a different color, flavor to them, but when you put them all together, you get an entirely different color and flavor, and that's helpful to describe the difference between the experience of a white woman versus a Black woman, or a person with a disability who's a woman, different from a man with a disability. So it helps to see diversity as the complex concept that it really is. So now I want to conclude this pre-work video with a basic overview of cultural competence. Again, the more aspects of cultural competence will be covered in Module 2. Cultural competence has a number of elements to it, and the most important element to think of in terms of our lenses and how we look at the world is what we call worldview. And worldview is part of your individual cross-cultural competence, and it's the lens through which we negotiate the world. It's the one that we interpret the world through, and it refers to a collections of beliefs about life and the universe that are held by an individual or by a group if it is shared amongst several individuals. If you think back on all the dimensions of diversity that we discussed and the graphic that we shared with you, you can picture that graphic as the iris in your eye, and essentially the way you see the world based on your unique diversity identifiers is what shapes that lens. The second concept has to do with our values. Our collections of beliefs and expectations, or our list of rules, is established in most of us by the time we're quite young. In fact, by the time we're 5 years old, it becomes mostly unquestioned and unconscious. And it's based on the behaviors that we were punished or rewarded for. We internalize those lessons, and they become our view of how to live, our list of shoulds and shouldn'ts, basically our worldview. Many people refer to this maybe as common sense, but as you can see, common sense is really culturally defined because it's only common to the people who are in the know. The third concept is culture. And it's important to define this here as more than ethnic or racial or national culture. Culture refers to the behavioral interpretation of how a community lives out its values in order to survive and thrive. And it's highlighted because different cultures exist in every community, and it becomes the set of norms and expectations that is not necessarily visible. Here's an interesting way to think about values and culture. When you ask people around the world what they value, most people say the same thing: family, respect, integrity, hard work. You hear those regularly. However, when you delve a little deeper on how they live those values, you start to see a lot of differences. For example, when you say you value respect, a person in North America and a person in Asia may see how respect is demonstrated very differently because they have different expectations. That's the different behavioral interpretation of a value. Value is the same, respect, but respect is demonstrated in very different ways and sometimes contradictory ways between cultures. So on the surface, it seems like we all value respect, that we all have a similar orientation. But when you go deeper, those very different behavioral interpretations can create very different impacts. In the last 10 years, intercultural competence or cultural intelligence, cultural competence has become a bit of a buzzword in many realms, and sometimes it gets misused. In fact, I've heard people sort of substitute cultural competence for diversity and inclusion, but it is not the same thing. Sometimes we get employer partners who call us and they're looking for quote-unquote cultural competence training. But when we talk to them and do a needs assessment, what they're actually asking for is diversity fundamentals or unconscious bias. So it should be noted that cultural competence is one part of the bigger topic of diversity and inclusion, sort of like chemistry is part of science. And in general, developing cultural competence can help individuals by increasing their own self-awareness, developing a more accepting and inclusive mindset, communicating more effectively, and leading more inclusively. So think of intercultural competence development as one tool in your diversity and inclusion toolbox for creating more inclusive leaders and a more inclusive work environment. So that, we just referred to how cultural competence helps individuals, but it also helps organizations. Cultural competence in an organization allows people to be their authentic self. And what we mean by that is hiding aspects of your authentic self takes a lot of energy. And if you're free to be yourself, you can have higher levels of engagement in the workplace as you're able to fully express your ideas without feeling the need to cover or hide parts of yourself. And this increases employee engagement. This connects to the Deloitte maturity model, where diversity and inclusion impact engagement. If cultural competence is a tool in your diversity and inclusion toolbox, then it will impact your engagement. A more diverse, inclusive, and culturally competent organization creates a more inclusive environment, and an inclusive environment internally has an impact on service to, whether you call them your clients, your patients, your students, constituents, members, whatever you call the people that you serve or develop products or services for. So this is the conclusion of the pre-work video for Module 1. Following this, please ensure you complete the remaining activities. Specifically, watch the Double Dutch Brain Game video on YouTube. You have been provided with the link in your pre-work booklet. Complete your Dimensions of Diversity activity in the pre-work booklet. And please make sure that you do that before the live meeting. The pre-work is necessary in order to get the most value out of the second element of this module, which is the live meeting. At the live meeting, we'll build on the pre-work and cover the following key topics. What is culture? How do people demonstrate cultural competence? And what happens when cultural differences are not managed well, or when there isn't cultural competence to manage them? From a technical perspective, you'll get a WebEx login information via email. Please try to connect 5 to 10 minutes before the meeting starts to ensure you're ready to begin the discussion. And we'll be using online discussion groups, various activities, and facilitation techniques such as polling, whiteboards, and breakout groups to help you apply the information that you've heard today and play around with that with other people so that the learning becomes more clear. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to joining you on the live meeting.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. For more information on upcoming events, please visit our website at ccdi.ca.